What you want, when you want it, where you want it. This is The Mesh.
This is
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod, a podcast
It's harder than it looks. I know. It's a tongue twister.
from Redhawk Publications. RedPubPod.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to Redhawk Publications' RedPubPod. I hope I did Robert Knight proud. He's not here today, so I am doing the intro he normally does, and he is dearly missed. My name is Patty Thompson, and I am the acquisitions editor with Redhawk Publications. And today on RedPubPod, we have the pleasure of having two poets, which we've been blessed to publish. We've got Tim Peeler, who has multiple poetry collections out there, and a new one that he's going to talk about today, but of course he's well known for his baseball poetry. And we also are very, very fortunate to have in-house Michael Loderstedt. And Michael is actually from out of town. He's from Ohio. He'll tell you a little bit more about himself, but he is a North Carolina boy because he's from the Outer Banks. And we were blessed to publish his book called Why We Fished, which happens to be one of my favorite covers, by the way, of all time, Michael.
Thank you.
So why don't we start with Tim? Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then maybe you can introduce Michael. And tell us how you know Michael, because you brought him to us.
Okay, I've been writing poetry pretty much since I went to college at East Carolina University, which was the place where I happened to meet Mr. Michael Loderstedt. While I was there, I roomed with and got to know a lot of the art majors on the campus, and he was definitely one of the shining lights there. He was the guy who won all the prizes and all the other artists were jealous of at the time, as I recall. But I got to know him very well. He was, at the time, one of the most serious artists that I had met. First, because I think this had such a huge effect on you and your life. Could you tell us a little bit about growing up on the southern Outer Banks?
Sure. Thanks, Tim, and thanks for that generous and thoughtful introduction. When I was there in the mid-'60s and early '70s, you would not recognize it from what it is now. There was very few houses there. We were one of the first families to move onto Emerald Isle, and we shared a school bus with maybe 5 or 6 other kids. Maybe a dozen families lived on that good 10, 15-mile stretch of sand. So we got to know each other quite a bit. And we also were next door to the village of Salterpath, which had been there for hundreds of years. So it was an interesting place to grow up and to ride the school bus with the descendants of whalers and fishermen. And it had a kind of profound effect on me. We were surrounded, as you might imagine, on an island by the beauty of nature. We were isolated. We had a lot of time on our hands. And I think all of those factors combined probably pushed me to find a path in life towards art and writing. I think, given as a kid, as I was, kind of small and not very strong and somewhat, bookwormish, I would have not excelled in sports or not excelled in maybe commercial fishing, which would have been the other career path. But I did excel in making things. And from that, I went on to East Carolina to study art and got to meet Tim and a number of other people, and it was like I expressed to you, it was like a cool drink of water. I had found my tribe. I was among my people. So to have that experience was one that I'm eternally grateful for. And then went on to graduate school, and then went on to a career both teaching art and writing. So
Yeah, and I would add, during the time that we were at East Carolina, which was the late 70s, like 76 to 80, somewhere along in there, it was a remarkable place. It was a wild, crazy, bohemian life going on there.
Sure.
But at the same time, if you looked around, you could find a lot of people that were really serious about what they were doing, like Michael.
Yeah.
And there were some artists there. I mean, it's hard to believe how good some of them were, like Michael Loderstedt, David Larson, Donald Mackey. I mean, those three guys had like almost like world-class ability, and it was hard to believe that there were three people like that in that one school, and I was lucky enough to get to know them.
Yeah, there were many more too, and I think the Times were there, and the Times I think were also fostering of this very wide view of art. My heroes at the time, Robert Rauschenberg and Joseph Beuys, and artists that had much broader views of what art could be. Influenced the way in which a lot of us were thinking at the time, and the music of the time too, with the Talking Heads and the kind of punk scene opening up, kind of was again a kind of much more expansive way to think about oneself as a creative culture worker. So all of those things I think have contributed to thinking about our work in much more overall encompassing kind of lifestyle in a way.
And I know that we're supposed to talk about poetry, and right now we've been talking about art because most of the years that I've known Michael, I knew him as an artist, a photographer, all these other things. And in recent years, he's taken up the pen and he's become quite a poet, very quickly somehow. But one thing I wanted to ask you was, how do different kinds of art overlap in your work?
Yeah, well, I think it's all part and parcel of making and thinking, responding to the world. When you're an artist, you're responding to the world through your objects, through the things that you paint or you sculpt, and I think those, and as a writer, you're responding to the world with words, and they're all kind of part and parcel of each other, building blocks and components of what it is you have to say. And like I said, as you mentioned before, my upbringing, having so many tremendous stories and memories, have been a kind of bank vault for mining that, to thinking about ways in which we've all had similar kind of stories and storytelling that I think can bring readers around to what we have to say, So like I said, I've been fortunate, I guess, in the sense that I've never thought that you had to be one thing or another. I've always eschewed those kind of confining categories. So, I think if you think of what you do in a much broader sense, you'll find multiple ways of getting at that itch, right? So.
And I might add that, Michael talks about making things. One of the things that he started doing in the last 10 or 12 years, he makes ukuleles, he repairs old guitars, and he's learning to be a musician. So it's like another thing that's being added to his toolbox, another genre of art.
And, I will say, I do think poetry is art.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
But you can also say it the other way around.
Sure.
Art is poetry. Yeah. So the fact that you're able to do many different disciplines of art, it's not surprising that you could be a poet as well.
Yeah.
And I am kind of curious, what is your main medium?
Well, lately it's been writing. I would say in the past, since COVID, I've been really working on that the most. The lutherie thing that Tim mentioned, building and repairing instruments, has been something to kind of put some bread on the table. But for the most part, I've been writing pretty consistently and thoroughly. I did have a couple of exhibitions last year of sort of installation-based textile works that were cyanotypes that I'd made from a project where I'd sort of readdressed what's growing in my yard, taking out the things that are just purely ornamental and putting back in plants that contribute to the biome, and sort of making an archive out of those plants through cyanotypes and then embellishing them with sewing and embroidery. So I I kind of let the project tell me where to go. I have some tropes I fall on, certainly photography being one, installation art where you kind of involve the viewer with the entire space of a room. Performative things have become more important to me, thinking about ways in which sound and music and words, kind of the spoken word, becomes really a kind of a powerful theater for expression. So I'm kind of moving towards, I guess, in some ways, the heroes of my art training have kind of moved towards. Robert Rauschenberg worked with Twyla Tharp on dance performances, and Joseph Beuys lived in a gallery with coyotes in New York City. So there's a kind of ways in which all of these things have led to a kind of performative expression, and I'm very interested in that. So,
could you maybe read us a poem
Sure.
from your book that would give our listeners an idea of how you were affected by growing up on the Outer Banks, maybe?
Of course. I thought about which one to read here, and I read a couple last night, and those have probably been the most read and talked about ones from the book. But I'm going to read one that's a little less talked about because I think it's really interesting, and it's called Calling My Stepfather 1 Year After Mom Died.
Well, that's one of my favorites, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I remember that hot, late August afternoon, the thick air unmoving as the box slid from the hearse, then dipped precariously toward earth. Is anyone lifting this thing? I squinted at the men beside and across who once knew her. If this casket hit the ground, it would be on me. Ma would be on me. I remember that mockingbird's crazy song, perched at end row of uniform white crosses near Island Road, going on and on and on like some skipping needle on a record player. When my stepfather answered, I said, "It's Michael." "Michael who?" "Judy's oldest son. I just wanted to ask how you're doing." "Judy's dead." "I know, Lester. I was at the funeral. Do you remember?" I thought about the last time he called, saying, "You've got to come quick." A year ago, barreling 600 miles to St. Helena, without stopping to eat, only to piss. Arriving just hours after she'd passed, her body gone, Lester bellowing in the corner like an old horse. At the funeral home, I kissed her cold forehead, slipped my middle school picture under her pillow. How now to go on in this world? Who will make the spaghetti sauce? Will I remember the laurel bay leaf? Add the day-old coffee? What measure will it take?
Very nice.
So I think about that poem, and, it's a story, derived largely from life, but often, what is it that kind of makes something suitable for a poem? And, I've tried, again, to expand that definition, and it's a poem about grief, but it's also about grief not only for the dead, but for the living. My stepfather, begins to lose much of his marbles, and I was concerned about him. He'd been a decent husband to my father, to my mother, and in that story, I think you get some of the tension of a stepson and a stepfather and how they will resolve to go on, and I think that's what's important about poetry, is I think you have to wager something that you can lose. It's like a card game. You have to have a hand in which it could all go wrong. If there isn't that wager that's important to both the reader and the writer, I think it's much less of a poem. So we try to keep that.
That's beautifully said. And I think that'll be like one of the descriptions up there. You have to have something to wager.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the difference between when reading a poem, if it really hits you, they've come close.
Yeah.
There is some poetry where you just feel nothing.
Yeah.
And that's okay, I get it. But for me, I want to see what you had in it, the skin you had in the game.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the reasons why this one, I'm reading it as you, as the poet, but then I start to think about my stepmom.
Yeah.
And after my dad died, and the relationship I had with her. It's universal themes,
Absolutely.
but it's something that hits at the heart. So thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And you've got to remember that he's writing that, he's translating something that's very foggy because memory is always foggy.
Oh, sure.
I mean, it's what you remember, but it's not necessarily what happened.
Yeah.
And, we talked a lot last night about what we think makes a poem compelling. And I was going to ask him that for the next question, but I think he's already answered it,
Yeah.
in talking about it's got to weight or something. My opinion is good poetry will always surprise the reader without trying to shock them. And that's what I look for. And it's something that you can almost feel viscerally instead of just think about whenever it hits you right.
Yeah, I would also add to that. I think, vulnerability is the poet's calling card, right? I think that's the thing in which, you certainly don't want to shock people that turns them off, but I think you also need to be willing to use your honesty and be willing to say the things that need to be said, and that I think is the thing that often I think young poets are afraid to do, and rightly so. Maybe they don't have the depth of their life experience, or maybe they want to tell everyone how smart they are, or do something that maybe is a little beside what could make a really strong poem. So think about looking at your own life, and again, thinking about what is it that makes good storytelling, and what is it that has moved you in your life. So,
And just so that everyone out there is aware, Why We Fished is available on our website at RedHawkPublications.com. I feel like I have to do that. Robert's not here. But in addition, Michael, you won an award with this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's right out the bat. He's poet, just newbie poet, but he's amazing, and he wins an award. Tell us about the award that you won.
Sure. Well, it's called the UK Small Book Awards, and it was it's an international new publication award, and there were, I think, in the year that I took it in 2023, I believe.
think it was 23.
23. There were, I think, 400 or so entries from around the world, and the jurors called me up actually from England and said, we want to give you second place, which I was delighted. And I guess the thing that they were most impressed with was the kind of package deal of the book, the photography, the side of America that they felt most Europeans were unfamiliar with, the fact that it came from kind of middle-class experiences and highlighted a culture that, in many ways along the coast, oddly enough, built by immigrants from the British Isles, they knew very little about, so it was terrific. So thank you.
Well, congratulations again.
Yeah.
Tim, I'm going to leave this with Michael. Do you have any questions that you might ask of Tim as a poet?
Just in terms of our backgrounds together, we come from kind of similar backgrounds, and I was wondering, Tim was talking a little bit earlier about how his growing up being a son of a preacher affected kind of both your interest in writing and language and all of that, and I think that would be interesting for people to hear.
Yeah, I was raised in a minister's house, as they say, and both of my parents came from farms. They were both the first person in their family to go to college and get a degree. My mother graduated from Lenore-Rhine when she was 19 years old and became a math teacher later, like after I started to school. But I was lucky enough to be in a house where there were books and where people read regularly, where we were taken to the library once a week, and where the bookmobile came past our house. And we looked forward to it. I mean, I can remember what the bookmobile smelled like when I got on it. I mean, that's how much of an experience that was. And I also, as I was telling Michael earlier, I remember seeing my dad write a sermon every week for 50 years and seeing my mother type it up and seeing what the process was. And although it's not like writing poetry, it is like writing something every week and forcing yourself
You have a prompt.
So I had that example of somebody who was working hard to try to communicate with other people.
Wow.
Sure. And, I was thinking about, too, and even to go beyond that, I would think a really well-written sermon has got to be poetic, I would think. You've got to bring people around to your rhetorical argument pretty quickly, right? And you have to kind of lay out where it is you like folks to go. I think the differences would be, and you could probably speak to this somewhat, Tim, is that, while a sermon would probably be more prescriptive than most poems, you're not telling people how to live. There's a kind of mission critical to both of these enterprises that uses language in a very abbreviated but powerful way.
Yeah, I think the poem tries to maybe hit a broader stroke than the sermon, because the sermon's trying to bring people into the fold, and the poem is just trying to figure out a way to communicate with that wide swath of people if possible. And I think I'm going to read a poem with Michael playing the ukulele here in just a minute.
If you'll let me.
This sounds like this is happening. Just so folks out there know, this is one of these immersive experiences that you only get at RedPubPod. Tim is going to be reading from his new book, which he's going to give us the title in a moment. And what we're going to have is Michael playing the ukulele.
So, also I wanted, maybe Patty could describe this. This is a hand-built uke of mine, and it's made of koa wood, the traditional Hawaiian wood that's used for ukulele building. Supposedly has a special sound, I don't know. Apparently a sound that you can live, you can see that lives in the wood. The fretboard is all inlaid with mother of pearl, and it's a pretty special little instrument. So
It's beautiful.
thanks. Yeah.
I took some pictures of it, so if you are looking at this listening to it on YouTube, you'll get to see a picture of it.
And let me give you just a very brief idea of what this book is about. There's a gentleman who comes back from Vietnam, gets involved in going to college at a 2-year college in the North Carolina mountains, and it's about his experience at that college, and it's a pretty crazy book, and it's somewhat based on some things that happened to me. It is my Montreat book. I spent 1 year at that school, although you would maybe not recognize that much of it in here. But what I'm going to do is read first two little short ones. Can you do that? Okay. And it starts off with a quote from this lead character, Gudger. His favorite writer is Honoré Balzac, and the reason is because when he was in Vietnam, he only had one book with him, and it was a book of short stories by Balzac. It became a joke with the other guys in his company. When they saw what he was reading, they started calling him Balzac. Anyway, that's where it starts. True love is eternal, infinite, and always like itself. Honoré Balzac. And that relates to what happens in this book, but you'll have to buy it from us when you see us somewhere if you want to find out what's going on. So the first poem is called Prologue. Gudger mailed Eveline a blue heart necklace he purchased on his one trip to Saigon. She was wearing it when she got killed in a wreck with his best friend. When he got back, her family gave it to him along with a box of letters that he had written to her from California and Vietnam. Late one night, in the backyard behind Granny's house, he burned the letters one at a time in Grandpa's old oil barrel, but he kept the blue heart necklace. I'll do one more short one. Gudger sat in his car, which had crossed the left lane, jumped the 2-foot ditch that the town council was so proud of, and now wedged itself so that the right rear tire gusted air at 10 to 15 miles an hour while the driver steered as if he was still on the road.
Tim, can you give us the name of your book, the new one?
This one is called Life and Times of Gudger, and it's a prequel to another one of the books that I did with Clayton Joe Young called West of Mercy. It ends at the point where that other book starts.
And this was published by Joe, correct?
Yes. We're doing our own little art press now.
And I should share with the audience, it is a beautiful book. There's, of course, Joe Young's photography in it and Tim's prose, and I encourage you to get it. However, it's not by Redhawk. You'll have to get in touch with either Tim or Joe. There will be some information on the description of this pod so that you can reach out to Tim or Joe and possibly get a copy, but this is limited release. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
Okay.
And we will be at the Hub in Hudson Thursday night, and Joe will bring copies there, so we'll have some for sale if anyone's interested. 6:30.
And great. I'll have all that information on the description. If you're listening to this after the Hub event, don't worry, you can still get a copy of it. But I just wanted to let you guys know that this is a very special book that you guys done. You and Joe did.
Thank you.
Okay, speaking of poets, what do you guys think about Kendrick Lamar?
I'll have to say, I've been a huge fan since the first mainstream album, Good Kid came out. I really went crazy over him with To Pimp a Butterfly. I thought that was the best book of this century. I mean, the best album of this century so far in pop music, and still do. I don't think he's quite come back to that level, but this last one is sort of a cross between Damn and To Pimp a Butterfly. He's found middle ground there. He's just fantastic. I hate that they kind of messed up his vocals on that Super Bowl thing. They had him muddied up. But if you watch the YouTube video, they fixed them.
Oh, good. I haven't watched it again, and I'll have to do that. But yeah, I remember him from The Kid also. And
Over 40 million people have watched it.
Wow, that's amazing. So think what you want, good or bad, but the public is still talking about it. So
Absolutely.
He's the Bob Dylan of hip hop. I mean, there's no doubt. He's just amazing.
He's won a Pulitzer. You got to put it out there.
Yeah.
Truly amazing.
Well, guys, I'll tell you what. I want to thank you both for your time. This has been one of the more, again, immersive experiences as our podcasts go, because we've never had somebody play while somebody's read their poems. I want to thank you both so much for coming in today.
Thanks so much for having us,
Thank
Patty.
you, Patty.
No problem.
We appreciate it.
And again, just to remind people that please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, our podcasts are available wherever podcasts are, on any platform that you want. Be sure to check out any updates of events that are happening on our Facebook page. And we have a sponsor, lest we forget. Tasteful Beans is our sponsor, and we encourage people to go there. In fact, last night we were just there with Tim Peeler and with Michael Loderstedt, because second Tuesday of every month, Poetry Hickory is going on at Tasteful Beans in downtown Hickory. We encourage you to go. And thank you, Tasteful Beans, for being our podcast sponsor. As we wrap this up, we want to remind you to go to redhawkpublications.com to get all of our books. And before we really finalize this program, we're going to ask all two of you to say the name of our podcast, RedPubPod.
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod. Pod.
It's harder than it looks.
I know. It's a tongue twister.
We tried to trick you on that one. Thank you again. This is Patty saying goodbye, and thank you so much for listening.
This has been
RedPubPod.
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 a podcast. RedPubPod from Redhawk Publications.
It's harder than it looks.
I know.
It's a tongue
twister.
You've been listening to The Mesh, an online media network of shows and programs ranging from business to arts, sports to entertainment, music to community. All programs are available on the website as well as through iTunes and YouTube. Check us out online at themesh.tv. Discover other network shows and give us feedback on what you just heard.